Welcome to EVRE. I'm sure many of you have already been here. Our first event is going to feature Maggie Larimore, and her real name is Nancy Zingrone, if I'm pronouncing that right. And she is a doctorate of parapsychology, curator of the AZIRE library here in Second Life. And I found her by what we call synchronicity. I was thinking of some ideas of events to hold on EVRE when I built it. And I searched a few keywords, and her AZIRE group came up in the search results. So I teleported over to her library, and I was astonished to find a whole bunch of, not only a very thorough library, but a whole bunch of photographs and connections to people in real life researching topics that EVRE is about. And I thought, how perfect is this? So I sent Maggie a message, and I said, I have a proposal for you. So that's what's called networking and following the path of coincidences. And look what happened. We have her as a guest on our sim, and she's going to go over some topics that are related to the taboo subjects of EVRE, which are, well, the taboo subjects of parapsychology and the paranormal and all of the related topics are really taboo still today in society. And I've learned by building EVRE that a lot of people, in fact, almost everyone that has visited the sim has experienced one form or another of these taboo subjects in their lives. So it's really blown my mind how common it is. So what I've done is, the goal for EVRE, the purpose of the sim is to connect people with the newer science in this field and present you with some real-life situations across the world with other people and other dimensions and other types of topics that are taboo, and see how much we have in common. We really have in common amongst each other, and we have personally experienced these things. And that's the reason I got into this topic, is not because I wanted to build something fancy and show a library of some interesting topics, but I have some own personal questions. And I am seeking answers, and I have found several. And one of those is precognitive dreams. We've all had maybe a little dream that kind of sort of came true the next day. But I've had about 30 or that I usually don't talk about with strangers, but I feel comfortable doing it in SL, especially given how many people I've come across that have experienced the same thing. And these 30 or 40 dreams I've had throughout my life are usually not about me. I've had one or two that came true about me or my life. But the others are about people that are strangers, and most are somewhere else in the world in another country. And usually on the third day after the dream, they come true. Down to maybe if it's an airliner crash, I actually see the name of the airline in the dream. And I don't actually know the location, but I can see an image around it and describe it to people. And I've documented these dreams in writing, email, and informing people before it happens, hoping, well, I kept it to myself for many decades, but eventually I thought maybe if I come out and tell people about it, I can, quote unquote, see if that prevents it from happening, because a lot of them are disasters or sad tragedies, which I think is key in that I think that we have so many strong emotions in some of these disasters that happen that we actually tap into a field where all of us feel it, even though we're not there. So that's an interesting topic that we can talk about with other guests as well. But Maggie's going to focus today on time slips, which is kind of, in a sense, a sort of haunting, where if you're in more than one time dimension at once, it sounds almost impossible to comprehend. But when there's real-life occurrences among people who are educated, people who have the faculties to explain to other people or even prove or supply evidence that it actually happened, it's worth listening to. And I think Maggie's going to present us with some amazing stories today that will show us that this is not all fiction. And if we can untaboo it, which I keep saying because Dr. Dean Radin has a lecture called The Definition of Taboo, then we can talk more openly about it and discover what's actually going on. So I think it's well worth a study, and I thank you all for coming here today. And we'd love to have your input. And with that, Maggie, I'm going to give you the podium and have at it. Let's see what you got.
Well, it's a delight to be here. I was so astonished and honored and excited when Tahiti first got in touch with me. She showed me some of her previous artwork, and we sat at her house and talked for a while. It was just such a wonderful opportunity, I thought, not only for the field, but for people to experience some of the feelings that may accompany having these types of experiences, whether it's time slip or a haunting or anything else that seems to be out of the ordinary. Because as you go through EVRE from memory to memory, there are some very wonderful emotions that get awoken in folks. I think certainly it did for me. It's an installation that I really wish wasn't coming down at the end of December, because it could be explored over and over and over again. It's just so beautiful, so lyrical, and so evocative of so many emotions that accompany having these types of experiences. So if you'll forgive me, Tahiti, I just want to correct you slightly in one thing. You got my name right, which is really wonderful. Most people say it wrong. I actually have a PhD in psychology from the University of Edinburgh in Scotland, but at the time that I was there, Professor Robert Morris was the Kersler Chair of Parapsychology, and we were all involved with the Kersler Parapsychology Unit, which is still in the psychology department at Edinburgh. Caroline Watt, Professor Caroline Watt, is now the head of that. So we all did our PhD dissertations on parapsychology, one kind or another. My husband also got his PhD there as well. So my degrees have always been in psychology, and I have always come at these experiences from a psychological point of view. I have some experiences of my own, but not so many. But I find them very, very, very fascinating, obviously. And it was a real blessing to be in a doctoral program where that was not only tolerated, it was part of the remit of the Kersler Parapsychology Unit. If you know who Arthur Kersler is, he was an author who wrote many books on all kinds of topics, a very deep intellectual from England, and he left sort of in the air a bequest that was to fund a university unit, and luckily for us it ended up at the University of Edinburgh. So that was the environment that I started in. Now today I'm going to be talking about time slip experiences, and I think Tahiti was perfectly right in characterizing these experiences as a kind of haunting or apparitional experience in which you come into contact with something that is clearly paranormal to you at the time and that you really can't dismiss. In many cases makes you believe that you are walking into another time period. And in reading some of these accounts, I don't think I would come to a different conclusion myself if I had these experiences at first hand. I want to say before I get started that there's a Chilbo box next to me, and if you click on that box, you can buy it for 0 lindens. It has a note card inside that gives you the link to the downloadable version of this PowerPoint on slideshare.net, as well as links to the 2 books that I relied on mostly, and also a very interesting guy who's not a parapsychologist. He's, I think, an amateur historian. He writes for Smithsonian and Fortean Times. His name is Mike Dash, and he's done some very good essays about the same cases we're going to talk about. Very much went through this book by Andrew Mackenzie called Adventures in Time. So if you'd like to click on that, you can get not only the landmark to the AZIRE Library and Learning Center, where there are many more recommended books and journal articles and websites of various researchers in the field, including Dr. Dean Radin, who will be speaking in December, Dr. Dick Bierman, who will be speaking in December, and Dr. Julia Mossbridge, who will be speaking sometime, I think, in late November as well. But there's more than them. We have quite a lot of websites on the boards where you can click and get to know who the researchers are, where they are, and in some cases they're websites like Dr. Radin's contain links to videos and links to published papers and so on. And I can't recommend highly enough the companion building to this auditorium, which is a marvelous audiovisual library of all kinds of wonderful things that Tahiti has found on her very broad definition of the paranormal, which is really an excellent resource while it's up and standing. And at the end, at the back of that pavilion, which is the companion pavilion in this bill, there is an opportunity for you not only to contribute your own experiences, but also to take a survey and see where you fit in terms of previous answers. So I recommend that you do that as well. It's one of the portions of this bill that is very difficult not to spend 2 or 3 hours in the first time you walk through the door. I want to say a little bit about where I work now. I'm a part-time consultant and a full-time research fellow, which is an unpaid position for the Parapsychology Foundation. I also teach psychology online at North Central University and spend a lot of time in Second Life doing what I can to spread the message about the scientific side of the field. I think lots and lots of people have read books about experiences and may belong to groups that do field investigations or are following field investigators, that kind of thing. But one of the things that's kind of lacking sometimes is a knowledge of the scientific side of the field. And it's a little slower moving, and the agenda is a little more difficult in the sense that we have to keep to the scientific method, and we have to be cautious, and we have to say, well, it looks like it's that kind of phenomenon, but we're not really sure, because science has to be kind of slow in coming to a conclusion, essentially, until a lot of people have come to the same conclusion. At the same time, most of us, I think, not all of us, but certainly most of us, I think if you sit us down for a beer, we'll tell you, yes, these experiences absolutely do happen, and some of them definitely provide evidence for precognition and for other kinds of paranormal experiences. So we kind of walk on that line to be able to speak to the scientific community and also speak to people and learn from people who have experiences. So anyhow, I'd like to welcome all of you today. I'm very happy to be able to talk about this, which is one of my favorite topics. I haven't given a presentation on it in quite a long time, and I was inspired, I think, to be a bit more artistic in this one. Tahiti gave me a link to a mini-series about a fictional character called Angelica Fanshawe that was done in 2008 in the UK, called The Devil's Whore, which I have no idea why they called it that, but it was a marvelous romp through a very, very difficult period in the history of England, and one of the cases that we're going to look at refers to a very, very important battle that took place during the Civil War in England as well. So after seeing that very beautifully visually done miniseries and wandering around EVRE on a relatively frequent basis since I first was able to come into the build, I've tried to be a little more artistic about this, so I hope that works out. So what we're going to be doing today is we're going to be talking about a variety of cases that may or may not give evidence, or give evidence maybe strong, maybe not so strong, about this notion that one can turn a corner and suddenly find themselves in another time, or that you can be fully in your present world and yet see something very complex that's occurring in a past time. So the first three things we're going to look at are 3 ghostly battles. Now these aren't the only ones. There are many, many cultures that have reported these kinds of after visions or after images of a very hard fought battle, whether they see it on the ground where the battle took place or in the sky above the area where the battle took place. And I'm just looking at these 3, but they certainly represent a wider case collection. The first one is the Battle of Marathon, and that's in Greece. A long time ago. The second one is the Battle of Edgehill, and this is the one that's depicted in this mini-series I was just mentioning. The third one, we're not sure if it really belongs in this category or not, but it's called the Battle of Nectansmere, or Dun Neftaim, And it was a battle that actually took place in the 7th century AD, and it's a case that has elements that are like the first two, but slightly different. Then the second section will be on entering another time, and one will be one from my own experience, and it's purely anecdotal. It was something a student told me many years ago, and I always call it Redcoats on the Road. The second one is from a book by two Cambridge professors. They had the experience in 1901, and they wrote the book about it in 1911, or published the book about it in 1911, and it's gone through many, 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 many editions, not only just in its first original form, but being brought out again by researchers who look at it, comment on it, talk about it, and kind of extend the meaning that you can get out of this particular experience. And it's Versailles because on a vacation in 1901, they turned a corner out on the grounds of the palace at Versailles near Le Petit Trianon, where Marie Antoinette was known to have wandered and spent a lot of her leisure time, and found themselves in a different place, in a different time. And the final one is Medieval Kersey, and that's a very interesting case. That's the one where I said World War II recruits, and actually I had that wrong. They were naval cadets who were in a kind of a summer program and happened to wander through what seemed to be a medieval village on a morning off after a weekend at a camp where they were being trained. And that's a very, very interesting case as well. Now, then we're going to talk a little bit about how do you distinguish between a case that may have evidence for movement through time and a case that's just a haunting. And there are a lot of different ways to kind of think about that. The top illustration that looks like a map is from a case that Tony Cornell, who was a very prolific field investigator for the Society for Psychical Research from the mid-1950s until almost his death in 2010, at least up until 2005, I would say. It's a case that he investigated of a homeowner who had seen more than once a group of Roman soldiers coming toward her house in that formation that's depicted in the second photograph. She called it a turtle, and it was actually called colloquially Tortuga, but it was actually a testudo, which is a formation in which a group of soldiers will hide themselves behind their shields in such a way that the folks on the corner can get their swords out, but everybody else is protected from arrows or swords or whatever else, and they're able to advance going forward. And the one at the bottom is an artist's depiction of Cistercian monks in a procession in an English monastery, an English cathedral rather, and that's very like so many of these hauntings that are place-based. They're in a house, they're in a monastery, they're in a church, they're in some location where they do the same thing. People who report seeing them and report what they see describe similar activities. A group of monks walking up a cloister, a priest at an altar. So it seems to be repetitive, non-responsive kinds of apparitions in which you see this happening in front of you. They may look real, they may look shadowy, but they always do the same thing, and they don't seem to be aware of you. They may not either be aware of the way the place has changed. So you hear reports in the literature of very, very, very short monks who look like they're walking along a floor level that's a few feet below where you're standing on the floor. So we'll talk about some of these things, and we'll talk about the SPR verification methods, which were very much part of what Tony Cornell did and very much a part of what Andrew Mackenzie did, about anecdotes with historical research. And this is where you find someone who has a story about an experience and tries to learn more about that house, learn more about the people it might be depicting, and so on. So it's not the verification methods that the Society for Psychical Research uses, and I'll describe who they are and what those methods are a little bit later. But you do like a lot of field investigators do these days, you do try to get the history of the house and the history of the people who lived in it and try and figure out whether or not any of the elements that the experiencer is reporting from that apparition or that haunting, whether any of those elements are true or can be corroborated by records. And then there's anecdotes that we all pass around, and I'm going to be guilty of telling you one as we get on a little farther, in which people have a story and they remember the story and they tell the story, and on the face of it the story seems to provide evidence, but we don't know yet whether digging underneath that story would actually produce the kind of evidence that a scientist or a historian or someone who's a little bit more skeptical about what's going on would take as being reliable or valid or something that you can build on. And then there are things like atmospheric features, and we'll talk about that when we get to Kersey. So there's a lot of theories, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. I'm going to come back to this slide. The top picture is the illustration from my Redcoat story, and the bottom is a painting of Marie Antoinette that was depicting her when she played milkmaid. So I don't know if you've seen the movie with, I've forgotten her name now, Kirsten Dunst, about Marie Antoinette and her husband. She had a tendency, because she was a young woman, that she and her ladies of waiting would go out to a building that was in the grounds of Versailles, and they would pretend that they were milkmaids all day long. Often she would be seen out in the grounds of Versailles as well, sitting on a camp stool with an easel in front of her and painting watercolors of the scenes around her, and was known to have worn that big yellow hat, and that'll feature in the Versailles experience. So many theories are out there, and at the end we'll talk a little bit about some of those clairvoyant hallucinations. You're picking up something from the environment of something that happened in the past, and you're constructing it into a picture for yourself, almost like a dream, of what that activity had been or what that event had been. Another theory that people put forward is spirits that are repeating meaningful moments without any sense of time, that somehow there's somebody in that apparition that goes from the back of the church to the front of the church every day at a particular time, showing no knowledge of the people around them, because they're just sort of stuck in that spot, doing it over and over again, something that meant something positive to them or something that was emotional, just repeating. There are recurrent hauntings that seem to be visual or auditory replay. One of the theorists in parapsychology, Dr. William G. Roll, who's best known for his work in poltergeist, used to say, and many people before him as well, used to say that when something has a huge amount of emotional impact, some event has this huge impact, such as a death or a murder, or when you think about this apparition that's reported at Hampton Court of Catherine Howard, who was one of the doomed wives of Henry VIII, ran down the hallway at Hampton Court and banged on his door and tried to get him to change his mind about her because she knew that it was going to end in a trial and she was likely going to be beheaded. And lots of people over the centuries have, exactly the gallery, have reported seeing this woman running hysterically down the hallway. So we hopefully don't want to think that she's still there running down that hallway every night. And some of the theorists have said, well, that emotionality somehow has imprinted that experience into the building itself, and people who are sensitive can pick that up. So it's kind of a combination of a clairvoyant hallucination and this notion that there might actually be something physical in the environment that you can pick up, that you can actually see. Another theory is that it's an intrusion of time that bypasses our chronological filter. Now, Dr. Mossbridge and Dr. Radin and Dr. Bierman all have physics training in neuropsychology and so on, and can talk quite a bit more about this than I can. I'm more of a social psychologist and a survey person, so I don't understand the physics underneath these types of points of view, but there's this notion that now that time is a dimension and that it exists sort of separately or interwoven with space, and that what we usually do as everyday human beings, our normal way of looking at the world, is to have this chronological filter that pushes time forward for us. But that in reality, some of these physicists say time doesn't work like that. Time is just always there, and it's ourselves as creatures, our organism, that makes this chronological line. And those folks who talk about time in that way will say sometimes there can be an intrusion of time that seems to bypass our chronological filters, so we're receiving information from what for us would normally be the past. And then there's another version of the same kind of time argument, which is that if suddenly you've traveled in time unexpectedly, except that you have a limited kind of perceptual ability in that environment as you get into the past and walk through. And you'll see what I mean from the Kersey experience. So I don't know which of these are true and which of these are not true, but they're all things that people have brought up to explain this type of experience. So let's get into the cases. First, we're going to look at the ghostly battles. Now, this is one of the earliest ones, and it was originally written out by a gentleman whose name was Pausanias. He lived in the 2nd century A.D., and he was writing about the past. He was known as Pausanias the geographer because he traveled quite a bit around the ancient world, which in itself is kind of paranormal, given how hard it would have been to get from one spot to the next. He wrote a lot about what people did in different places and what their culture was, what their myths were, how they had been impacted on their history, what was the history that they remembered. He was similar to Pliny the Younger, who wrote encyclopedias in which he gathered information from friends who had traveled and from his own travels about all kinds of things in the natural world, including some things that we would consider to be paranormal, such as out-of-body experiences. Well, Pausanias was both interested in history and in myth. In the Battle of Marathon, which took place in 490 BC when the Persians were fighting with the Greeks, there was a horrendous battle on a plain that was next to a town called Marathon. And I don't at the moment remember who won that battle, but many people were killed. I think the Greeks did in this instance. Many people were killed, and many of the farmers and the tradesmen of this, thanks Medora, of this village actually took up their plowshares, whatever they could find that seemed to be useful as a weapon, and went out onto the plain and tried to fight for their side as well. So many people died, and many of the people in the village knew who these folks were. Held back the Persians, thank you, Medora, until others joined in. Was that the first Persian War or the second Persian War? I don't remember. That's not one of the ones that I reread before I came here today. The interesting thing for us is that the villagers, now this would be many centuries later, because we're talking 490 BCE was the time in which the battle took place, and the 2nd century AD was when Pausanias wrote down his account of what was going on. The villagers said that there were almost immediately ghostly battles fought on that same plain. And at the beginning, they were able to pick out, the villagers had a story that had been handed down that the villagers of the time who had lived there when the battle took place could pick out their loved ones, or famous farmers who picked up their plows and went off into the fray and tried to fight for their side, that they could hear the sounds, that they could see the horses, that they could see the people fighting each other, they could see people dying, they could smell what was going on in this place. And over time, the battle was still seen, but less frequently. And it became part of the village's religious practice to honor the fallen dead from Marathon. and to not be afraid, but to feel that they should go to the edge of that field and witness the apparition whenever it happened. So it became part of the ethos of the village, and this was the story that Pausanias had told. Now, obviously, we can't go back and interview anybody from that era who saw this event take place, but it's certainly a story that has a lot in common with other of the better witnessed and the better investigated cases. A terrible battle that takes everybody's imagination, that people have a stake in, that's seen again and again and again, but in a way fades over time too. It's not always as strong as it was to begin with. And this is not, as I said before, this is not something that you only find in the English heritage. It's all over the place, basically, in different cultures and different places. So one of the next ones that I want to talk about, and you'll find information about this both in Investigating the Paranormal and elsewhere, is the Battle of Edgehill. In this period in English history, this is the period of the Roundheads and the Cavaliers. So there was this terrific fight for a different way of being governed, in a sense. And there were folks who were very much against the notion that King Charles should be doing what he was doing. This was Charles I, and that the land and the ability to make a living and keep your family whole and well was all in the hands of folks at the top. And this was totally unfair. There was a lot of religious foment going on at the time, all kinds of different aspects of dissent from what was considered to be right behavior and right beliefs and so on. So the Roundheads, who were the people who were fighting in the army of Oliver Cromwell, who later, took over the story in the English Civil War, it was a terrific split among the people. It was a very bloody war. The folks who were involved, sometimes the families were split. It was a lot like our own Civil War, that the families were split between the two sides. Well, there was just a lot of death. There was a lot of blood running everywhere. Ultimately, you have the Roundheads winning, and Charles is put to death. Then Oliver Cromwell finds it's a fairly difficult job to keep the country going and ends up taking on some of the characteristics of a king because he was governing. And, of course, over time, he kind of solidified his position, and his former comrades were trying to get him out of his job, and eventually Charles' son came back and became Charles II of England, and that started the period that's now known as the Restoration. So it was a really fraught time. It was fraught on religious grounds, it was fraught on political grounds, and even personal freedom and all that kind of stuff. So one of the most important first battles was near a town called Kyneton, and it was in a field called Edgehills, and it was one of these knockdown, drag-out, unbelievably violent, horrendous kind of a battle. It was at the beginning of the Civil War. It didn't depose Charles. That wouldn't happen for many years, but it was just a very difficult and bloody and horrendous battle. A few days after the battle had finished and the battlefield had been cleaned, people had come and got their dead and taken them out, and they buried folk and all that stuff. Villagers were surprised to hear and to then see the battle occurring again, but not on the ground, a little bit above the ground. And they could sit down and pick out the colonels and the generals from both sides, including a couple that were known to have survived the battle, and the horses and all of the stuff, smells, everything. It continued on for so long that King Charles sent an emissary to come and see if he could see it too. And he was able to, and this resulted in a pamphlet that was published at the time, which was a very deep description. The clergy around the area were attesting to the fact that this was happening, that people could see it, and that it was possible in this vision to be able to pick out individuals that they knew along the edge of their perception of this battle. So somewhat similar to Marathon. Again, there were sounds, there was, it wasn't like a gray and white, you know, kind of film replayment. It was like the whole thing was happening again, but in a spectral way, a little bit higher off the field, not quite as distinct, of course, as the battle, but you could feel what was happening, you could see people, you could identify them, you could hear the sounds of the battle. So it was a very, very amazing kind of an experience for the area, and certainly was a testament to how difficult these kinds of things were at the time. And it went on for some while. It was perceived by a lot of people. More than one person wrote about it. There are documents that have come down to us that were really first-hand accounts. They may not have taken place on the day it first appeared. Maybe it was a week later, a couple weeks later or something. But they were as close to first-hand accounts as we can get from this distance in time. So here's another example of one of these things that are so, it's a very emotional thing, and people are seeing it, and people at the beginning, at the time of the first part of the apparition's lifetime, shall we say, were able to identify people that they knew. And you hear things a lot like this about the Battle of Gettysburg here in the United States, about a Native American battle that took place on that same ground some centuries before. Even some of the Civil War soldiers reported seeing that. So these kinds of things are out there, and what do we do with them, basically, is the problem. I'm not sure when the last reported sighting of this was, but it certainly carried on for many years. The third case is a little contested at the moment because not the actual investigation. It was investigated by James McHarg, and I forgot to put his information in on the note card. But I will put the articles that I've mentioned, I'll put a PDF version of all of them into the library on the third floor of the AZIRE library, so you can go up and pick them up and take a look and read them. This is an interesting one. This took place in Scotland, in what's known as Lothian. I think it's a little bit south of Edinburgh. So a young woman was at a party. It was in the 1950s. It was in 1950 itself. And a young woman was coming home from a winter party when her car, she had a flat tire, or the car ran off the road, something like that. And she decided to take her flashlight and walk across one of the fields to get home to her apartment, and then was going to send somebody later to come and pick up her car. And as she was walking along, she saw what she thought were people carrying torches out into the field of Nectansmere. Now, this was an area that at the time was thought to have been the site of the Battle of Nectansmere, which took place in 685 AD, so in the 7th century. Now people, and you'll see this in Mike Dash's article, now people think that actually that particular battle took place a little farther up and more on the western side of Scotland than over there in the east near Edinburgh. However, whether or not the location has been identified correctly as being the plain where the Nectansmere battle took place between the Picts and the Northumbrians. Certainly there were many, many battles that took place over Scotland in those centuries, and could have been, even if it's not, turns out not to be Nectansmere, and I think the evidence is now going in that direction, that really Nectansmere itself, that particular battle, took place on the west side of Scotland. Something must have happened there. What she talked about, which was very interesting, was seeing these people carrying torches. And as she was walking along the side of the Mere area, so she would have been on, as you look at the 1950 map, she would have been walking along that bottom edge on her way over to where the houses were. She not only saw people carrying torches, at least she said so, she also saw people, what she saw them carrying the torches for was to try and find, it looked to her like people were walking among the wounded and the dead, looking for their own family members, and that there were people in outfits that, you know, their clothing and the weapons and the torch itself, all of these things to her said 7th century, that this was definitely something in that era or maybe earlier that had happened. And once again, as she walked through this, she could hear some of the sounds that were taking place. So it wasn't just seeing what was going on, but she was able to hear it. She walked along the side of it, and she finally got home, and then she reported it. Dr. James McHarg, who was a psychiatrist and a researcher connected to the Society for Psychical Research, he lived in Scotland, had a long practice. Carlos and I had the opportunity to meet him when we were there as graduate students, as well as Andrew Mackenzie, who wrote the book Adventures in Time that I have given you the link for. And look for it in Google Scholar, Google Books, because the people that are selling it on Amazon are definitely not nice people. They're trying to make millions on the book. Definitely Tahiti, exactly, a very emotional event. She was interviewed at length by James McHarg using the SPR method, and they tried very hard to figure out whether or not this really was the Battle of Nectan's Mere. What did she see? What did she remember? A complicating factor was that she was coming home from a party, so she was a little bit tipsy. She wasn't exactly in a clear space. On the other hand, there's evidence in the experimental research that if you're in an altered state of consciousness, sometimes you're more susceptible to these things, so maybe being a little bit drunk helped her see what she saw. And there were a lot of counter explanations, that it might have been a waking dream, something that didn't happen, something she imagined, something that came to her later after she was home and recovered. There's a wonderful paper by Peter McHugh and Alan Gauld. Alan Gauld is a senior citizen in the Society for Psychical Research and was Tony Cornell's partner in ghost hunting from the 50s until, well, at least for 50 years, the two of them were out there. And he's still around. He's an emeritus professor of psychology from the University of Nottingham. Peter McHugh is well known for doing very detailed analyses of some of these old cases and of modern cases as well. So there's a good article that I'll put up in the library by them, in which they've re-examined Dr. McHarg's look at it, as well as looked at the question of finding out what battle this might have been. Now, Mike Dash's article, which appeared in the 14 Times magazine, is a skeptical look at the same battle, and he's kind of more thinking that she really only saw the lights that seemed to be at the top of the torches, and that those might have been earth lights related to tectonic strain, and that from those lights proceeding along in what looked to her to be an orderly manner, she elaborated that in her altered state of consciousness. The way that we in scientific parapsychology look at these cases is to look at them from both sides of the coin. Can we explain this away? Is it reasonable to explain it away, given whatever testimonial evidence or physical evidence there might be for the experience? If we can't explain it away, then the physicists need to take a look at it and say, what the heck is this? I mean, we as psychologists also can look at it and think about the alternate explanations that have to do with maybe a clairvoyance that turns into a hallucination, or picking up something from the environment, all those theoretical viewpoints. But if in fact the person is walking along the edge of some kind of crack in time, and believe me, I'm saying that with no knowledge of what a crack in time would be, if there is some kind of a time slip here, then is that person seeing something that happened? And if so, why aren't the people there seeing her? And how would we wouldn't know that anyway? And there's certainly a lot of Gettysburg stories. Well, not a lot, but there's a couple of stories in the ghost books that come from Gettysburg in which people have had experiences where they are seen, they seem to be seeing the person that they're watching doing something that has a historical meaning, suddenly turns around and sees them. These cases are not like that. They're non-responsive, but what is the relationship then of these types of cases to those? So there's always a question in our minds about what all of this really means. At the same time that these types of things are endlessly fascinating. So in the ghostly battles, there are some commonalities. They begin usually soon after the event they depict is over. That we have no evidence for with Nectansmere. They recur sometimes over centuries, that people will see them again and again and again, and even at a very distant time from the moment in our chronological time when the thing first happened. Okay, so some of these things are not even visual. They're auditory, they're distant, and they're faint. There's a couple of cases in Adventures in Time that he talks about that are like that. People across the channel from France, years after the Second World War was over, hearing what they thought were the sounds of a battle that took place across the channel. So it may be sounds, they may be distant and faint, but they seem to be identifiable and connected to this original event. They might be completely visual suggestions of the original event with sounds and smells and identifiable people, and that's certainly how Pausanias talked about the Battle of Marathon and how the king's emissaries wrote about the Battle of Edgehill, that there were sounds, there were smells, it was so vivid and people were identifiable. And then these things do seem to fade away as the memory of the event fades away, but in terms of Nectansmere, there's no evidence that the woman who had that experience was a historian of the era and would have been thinking about that necessarily as she walked by the edge of the mere. They arise, as Tahiti was mentioning, from profoundly emotional moments, but then, like some of these other kinds of things, it could be quiet or pastoral but elaborate, and you'll see that in the next section of cases. I'm sorry, I'm going to go a little bit faster. So this second version of cases are the ones that I'm calling entering another time, and this illustration that you see here is a painting of the village of Kersey in 1957, which is around the time of the case that I'll be talking about. So you can see, as you're looking at this picture, and you'll see it again, there are some structures in this village that even in 1957 seem very medieval. So first I'm going to talk about that category of cases that are only anecdote. And this is something that is also kind of characteristic of these types of cases, where you see people moving by you or moving away from you, moving around you, who are part of a different era. And you may not recognize that to begin with, but they don't interact with you. You can hear the sounds again, you can see the people, you can see the activity happening, but you're not aware that these aren't real people in your time, or you may become aware that they aren't. When I was a lot younger, in my 20s, I've taught adult education courses on Saturday mornings at the Field Museum of Natural History in Chicago, where I was living at the time. The gentleman who ran the program was a very adventurous sort of a guy, and he wasn't at all afraid of the taboo that came from having any courses about parapsychological content. So I taught several of them. I taught an intro, I taught a ghost, poltergeist, and hauntings, and I taught one on reincarnation as well, just telling them what the science of parapsychology was doing at that moment in time about these kinds of experiences. In one of those courses, on the first day of class, we were talking about all the various phenomena that are under study in scientific parapsychology, and it's a pretty wide list of paranormal phenomena. Usually doesn't include anything to do with UFOs or unusual creatures or anything like that. It's all sort of ESP and ESP, so extrasensory perception, and psychokinesis/telekinesis based. Ghosts and hauntings, out-of-body experiences, near-death experiences, that kind of thing is what where the boundaries of the field are. So we had just finished talking about all the phenomena that were involved in studying parapsychology, and we had started to talk a little bit about ghosts, and she raised her hand and she told the class a story that she was about 30, I would say late 30s in this class. I was in my 20s. And she said that when she had been 10 years old, she lived in one of the colonial states, Massachusetts, I think it was, and she lived near a town that had been very important in the Revolutionary War. I don't think there'd been a battle in the town. I think it was taken over and occupied by British troops. So she and a girlfriend were playing in those days. Social services didn't come and take your parents away if you let your kids go out in the woods and play. So she and a girlfriend were out playing in the woods when they saw a row of, a big line of people dressed like the British soldiers of the colonial period, either the time of the Revolutionary War or prior to that. So they were tall soldiers in red coats, similar to the illustration that you see here. And the girls thought, oh, this is great. There's going to be a reenactment, and these are people marching into the center of town for the reenactment. So they got up from what they were doing, and they started to run along the side of the road. And they ran alongside these soldiers for about 10 minutes. They couldn't get anybody to turn and look at them, and nobody responded to their, calling out to them. So they decided to run faster and get into town and be there to greet these reenactors when they came into the village square. So they went to the middle of the town and they sat there and they waited 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 and nobody showed up. That road only went to the center of the town. So finally they gave up and they both went home for dinner, and they both were punished for being out so late that they nearly missed dinner, and they both had the same excuse, that they had been waiting for the reenactors to come into town because they'd seen this wonderful column of redcoats coming into the town, and were punished because the parents knew full well that there wasn't a reenactment going on and there weren't people like that on the road, and so they must have made it up. But she and her girlfriend both believed very strongly that this was a real experience, and they had seen these people, and over time they came to believe that they had somehow seen into the past, and that these were not reenactors who somehow disappeared or turned around before they came to the town, but that they were in fact maybe the column of soldiers that had come on some fateful day into the town to take it over. And I think that's probably why she took my course, too, was so that she could tell that story and have other people tell her that, they'd had similar experiences, and to be able to read about other experiences that were similar to the ones that she had had, and to be told that she wasn't crazy, which, of course, I didn't think she was. There were plenty of other types of experiences like that in the literature that had been investigated. So that's a story that I always tell, and it exists only as an anecdote. I don't remember her name. I don't have my grade book from that era. That was so long ago, and I can't go back to her and double check and see if now that she's, 70 years old or so, that she still remembers this experience. At the same time, what we do with these unexamined, unresearched cases is kind of stand them up against the research cases and look for differences in their shape and their structure and the types of things that people say, and it's kind of a corollary kind of evidence. It's not evidence that you can use really. It doesn't stand up very well because it's a story, but it kind of helps make the context out of which the research experiences come. Now these ladies were two professors at Cambridge University in the early 1900s. There were only a couple of colleges at Cambridge that allowed women to attend and that hired female professors to teach them. One was Newnham College, and I've forgotten the name of the other one, but there were only two, I think, in 1900. And these ladies were professors who taught in one of those women's colleges. And in 1901, they decided they would like to take their summer vacation and go to Versailles and wander around in the palace, see the palace, and also wander around on the greens in the area behind the palace. And they wandered out of the building and were talking about what was going on when they seemed to pass a man at a gate and turn onto a road. And when they turned onto the road, the quality of their perceptual experience changed. And there's some discussion over when they told each other about their own individual experiences, about how much their individual experiences match up. But in general, what they wrote about was finding themselves on this road. It felt windless, as if the sound had left and the wind was gone, and it was so silent, and it became eerie and almost two-dimensional. And as they walked through this area, they saw scenes of people. They saw a woman dressed in a costume from the 18th century who was hanging sheets out a window. They saw an old gentleman who was dressed in what looked like an 18th century waistcoat and coat, and the trousers and so on. They passed a knoll by the Petit Trianon where this beautiful lady in a big yellow hat was sitting on a camp stool doing watercolors. They wandered towards the area where the milk house was, where Marie Antoinette and her ladies-in-waiting would get some recreation. And they had this experience, and eventually they turned around and started to come back up into the buildings. And as they did that, this eeriness, this sense of being somewhere strange, seemed to disappear. Later they went back into that area and couldn't find some of the structures that they had found before, and certainly didn't find any reenactors, and were told by people in the palace that there weren't any. They discussed this with them. I think it took them quite a while, maybe a day or two or more, to start to talk to each other about this, and they began to piece together their experience. Now, they decided very specifically that this must have been 1789, that somehow or other they saw into 1789, which was a very decisive and negative year for Marie Antoinette and you know, for France in general, and that this was the emotion of the time that had made this particular experience come alive and allowed them to view and have a first-hand, I keep saying the word experience, but a first-hand experience of what that time was actually like. Andrew Mackenzie, in Adventures in Time, is quite critical about how particular they were about when they pegged this experience to about the actual year, because he found in investigating the medieval Kersey case that there are lots of elements that you have to kind of pull together and think about, and that it could well have been something depicting a day many years before that, when Marie Antoinette was first there. It may have been a happy time. He also talked about how it could have been they were picking up her emotions of remembering that time. There was a leap, he thought, to judgment in terms of saying this was 1789. We walked through 1789. The book was published and republished and published and republished. People were very excited about it, and there have been reports of similar types of experiences in that area around Versailles that are more modern. I don't think they come into the 2000s necessarily, but there are some more modern cases, that experiences that kind of harken back to what Anne Moberly and Eleanor Jourdain mentioned. And as I said, you can tell by those three book covers on the side. The very first one is the original 1911 printing of An Adventure, and it's actually the frontispiece. And then there is another book that was re-examined. They brought out her original, was also, re-examined by scholars of these types of experiences. And then the third one is the more modern one, which has been re-examined by Michael Coleman. So people are still very interested in what really happened and what you can tell from the testimony that they wrote, and how you can be critical of how they constructed their story, and yet still give the experience some honor, and to understand that this was something that happened to them. How much of this can you verify, and can you find elements about it that will say that this was a kind of time slip experience? Certainly the executor and their family now is not very happy about this book, and there were generations along the way who weren't so happy about this as well, but they had, both of them, impeccable, that's what we're told anyway, impeccable reputations at the time, and people took it seriously and thought, not everybody, but at least in psychical research, took it seriously and thought that perhaps this really happened, that they came down and took a turn and somehow found themselves back in time, but in this limited way where you couldn't hear the sounds and you couldn't feel the wind, and it all felt sort of dreamlike and not exactly real, but strong, a strong experience. So that's another one of these cases that everybody goes back to and tries to sift through, and then takes a look at more modern cases to see what are the elements that are the same. How does this compare to Battle of Edge Hill? There's lots of differences, some similarities. How does this compare to other experiences where people talk about this unusual kind of atmospheric change, that you've gone somewhere that's not where you were, and it's someplace that's not going to be there when you look away or when you walk out again. So that brings us to Kersey. On the left-hand side, we have this wonderful painting of Kersey in 1957, and what's important to see in this picture is up in the upper left-hand corner, you see that tower. I don't have a pointer, but there's a tower there in the back to the church. And then there's rows of houses. There's a hotel there that counts its founding back to the 14th century. There are a few buildings that still have elements of the medieval time, and there were many more in 1957. Some of the skeptics of this particular story say that the village itself had such a medieval look to it that these young, impressionable boys could have somehow had a hallucination about this place that was caused by the way the place looked. And certainly in the haunting research, Dr. Bill Roll did a study back in the 80s in which it showed that people who were in places that had more of the kind of stage setting that you would expect to see in a haunted house were likely to put a haunting in that spot, and in other spots they would say no. But people who were known to have psychic ability could distinguish between those places in some cases. But the environment does have an impact on what you're expecting to see and what you're expecting to hear and what you think is going on and how comfortable you feel in that space. So some of the skeptics have said that, well, look how medieval it looks. So the story is there were 3 naval cadets. They were young men in their teens, and they had come to a base that was not so far from Kersey for training. And on the Sunday morning at the end of their training weekend, these 3, Mr. Lang, Mr. Baker, and Mr. Crowley, Mr. Lang and Mr. Crowley were both born in the countryside in England and were used to the countryside, and Mr. Baker was a guy from London, so for him this was all totally different. All the cadets were told to go off in pairs of 3 and explore the countryside and come back, and at noontime, at the noon meal or the 1 o'clock meal, they would talk about what they saw and what the countryside was like and so on. So it was kind of both a relaxation exercise and a way to, keep them kind of observant and so on. So these 3 went off down a road, and they were supposed to go, they were told to go to Kersey. So they were trying to figure out how to get there. They managed to stop and talk to a farmer who was in his fields with his family, and he pointed them down the road. They started off down the road, and then they crossed. This was in 1955. They crossed over a fence into a series of small farm fields, all of them bordered on the edges, as they do in England, with hedgerows. And they talked about having to squeeze through the hedgerows and having a difficult time going from field to field. At one point, as they were getting close to the town, to the village, there was a big old rabbit down on the ground in the brush that didn't seem to have the instinct to run away. So that they thought was kind of funny. They managed to pick him up and then toss him off. They were hearing the church bells in the village ringing, so it was a Sunday morning, and they were hearing that. And then they crossed over a hedgerow that was very close to that far side of the village. So you see there's the far side of the village, and then the road kind of comes down steeply from the church tower down to that little creek that's passing over the road below. As they came closer, suddenly there was no sound. The church tower was no longer visible. There was a grove of trees. There was certainly no sound of the bells. There was no wind. There were no birds singing. There was none of the sounds that they would have expected. This was fall, so there had been fall colors, and it was a brisk, cold morning. And as they came over that rise at that far end of the town, of the main street, suddenly it was spring colors. The trees looked like early spring. It was still sort of the same temperature, but it was a very different kind of a feel to it because it was so quiet. As they walked down this road, on one side of the road there were no cottages. It was maybe one or two and lots of woods. And on the other side there were a few cottages in a row, and they looked very old and very decrepit and very, very much falling down, with very small windows, but with glass in the windows. And that's important later when Mackenzie began to investigate it in terms of figuring out what time it was. They didn't see any people. They didn't see any cats. They didn't see dogs. The only animals that they saw were a group of ducks that were down at the bottom across that stream. And the stream, as they were coming down, was quite a bit higher than that and had a small footbridge where those horses are drinking that came over the running of the stream. And the ducks were sort of underneath the footbridge and to the side of the footbridge, and they weren't moving. They weren't quacking. They weren't doing anything. So it was like this very, very static kind of experience. As they came down, they looked into a window of one of the first of the houses, and they saw sides of meat hanging from sticks, and those sides of meat were green with mold, just horrible green with mold, but they couldn't smell anything, which they thought was very strange because obviously it was an old building. It wasn't very well put together, and they should have been able to smell that meat rotting away on the other side of the window. Each of the houses that they went down and looked at had nothing in them. There were no tables, no chairs, no nothing, lots of cobwebs, and the town seemed to be abandoned. When they got down to the water, when they turned around, they were so spooked, at least this is what Mr. Lang said later on, they were so spooked they just ran back up the hill. And as they got past the area where the trees were and where the butcher shop was, and got a little bit past the edge of the village, then suddenly it was winter. It was fall again. Things were fall color. They could see the tower of the church. They could hear the bells ringing, just like they had shut off and now they turned back on again. And it scared the heck out of them, and in Mr. Lang's telling of it, it scared them so badly that they ran back to the base where they had done their training and told this whole story when it came to their turn to talk about it. The officers who were teaching them didn't make much of anything out of the story except to comment on the rabbit. I think they felt, Mr. Lang said that they felt that the officers just thought they were making a tall tale and probably hadn't completed what they were supposed to have completed. So many, many years later, Mr. Andrew Mackenzie got in touch with Mr. Lang and got all of his detail, and lots of detail. And a few years after that, he was able to get Lang to come to England, and they both went to modern Kersey. So this would have been quite a bit later than 1957. And he was able to find the place that had been a butcher shop. He was surprised to see the whole church there, and he could tell them, he could show them places where they had been and what had been, tell him what had been there and so on. So he took all of that down and they investigated, and the house that he identified as a butcher shop is a hotel. And there's no evidence in any of the county records or the church records or the official history of that building of it ever having been a butcher shop. But there was in one tax document a statement of a particular family that had lived there, and they found someone who was from the descendants of that family and who told them without being prompted that yes, there was a legend in the family that they had been butchers in the town to begin with. So they have no real physical evidence that that was true, but they have that little piece of a snippet from a so-called family member. They then investigated the church and the tower because as they looked into some of the details about the houses, such as glass didn't come into that village until later in the 16th century, the early 1500s, and wouldn't have been there in certainly the 1400s or the early 1500s. Mackenzie's first idea was that this was post Great Plague, the Black Death Plague of the 1360s, 59 to 60, and that would be why maybe why there were no people living in the village when in the village that the boys might have seen. Then he started to look more into the church records, and there had been a church under construction, and they had started working on the tower before the Black Death. It wasn't finished until 1490, I think, which was almost a bit more than a century later, and it would have not been visible above the tree line between 1420 and 1460. So they finally decided that maybe it was more towards the end of that period when that particular way of dealing with glass had started to come in. Because prior to that, if you were a regular person, you wouldn't have glass in your windows. You'd have wooden shutters to keep the cold out at night. Then Mackenzie went, and this is very much the SPR method, as we'll see in a minute. He went and got a hold of Mr. Crowley, who was the second person, and he remembered some of the elements. He remembered how cold it was, how quiet it was, that there was nobody speaking. He remembered looking in and seeing the sides of beef, but he didn't remember the ducks. He didn't remember any of the rest of it necessarily, and I'm not sure that at the moment I can't remember if he remembered the sound of the bells coming and going. And Mr. Baker, the young man, who was then a young man from London, remembered absolutely nothing. He remembered the day in the training that the three of them set off, and he remembered the rabbit in the fields, but other than that, he didn't remember anything about the medieval village. So Mackenzie went through and did a lot of research to see what could be made of this case. And when we get to that slide, we'll talk about that. So were they entering another time? This was certainly a spontaneous experience that they felt depicted times long past. And both Crowley and Lang said that it felt eerie in the village. It was quiet. It felt like people were watching them. They were just spooked by the whole experience. Not the same amount of details, but spooked by the whole experience. These types of things seem to be usually one-off reports of a vivid experience. There aren't any more that I'm aware of these kinds of things about that particular village in the literature. Then usually silent or windless or exceedingly still, and that was something that was the same in the Kersey experience as in the Versailles experience. But they might be complete visual suggestions of the original event with sounds and smells and identifiable individuals. There's at least one case from the records from the history of these kinds of things around the Gettysburg battlefield, where people had written about experiences where they suddenly ended up in a place that had been a hospital during that battle and certainly could smell and hear everything that was happening. They might be a complete visual suggestion of the original event with sounds and so on. There might be an entry point and an exit point, and for some of these, Mackenzie also has a number of cases where people are seeing a house, and then the next time they walk down the road, the house is gone, and it's a huge house. It's a manor house, and the gardening, everything around the house is different, and it's like they come and they see it, they turn and look away, and they look back, and it's not there. They come into the experience of a quiet place, or they leave that experience, and sometimes these things are solitary. But what's very interesting is that some of the cases that have gotten into the literature are actually shared. Miss Moberly and Miss Jourdain saw some of the same things. Mr. Lang and Mr. Crowley saw some of the same things in their experience. So what happened? So trying to distinguish between whether something is a time slip experience or a haunting is a bit difficult. Now, Tony Curdell, in Investigating the Paranormal, which is affordable, unlike Adventures in Time, investigated this one, a case from Ickleton in the UK, in which the homeowner was talking about seeing a line of Roman soldiers in this particular testudo configuration marching across near her house. And when he went through the information that he was able to get, there was definitely a Roman road that had passed through her property. It made sense in terms of where she was seeing the apparition and so on. But was this something that was an opening in time, or was this just a haunting, a repetitive haunting of something that happened very frequently along that road? There are a number of books. Noted Witnesses for Psychic Occurrences is a fantastic book that was published in 1963. It was compiled by Walter Franklin Prince quite a bit earlier, of testimonies from all kinds of people who were well known in the late 19th century and the early 20th century. And some of these cases are quite interesting. Seeing Ghosts by John Murray, which came out in 2002, is kind of like a field guide to all the different kinds of hauntings, apparitions that are out there, and there are many that are repetitive and non-responsive. And this is from a friend of mine, actually. It's one of her most recent books. It's called Haunted Bachelor's Grove. And this is kind of another indication of a haunting where nothing much is happening. Essentially, this is a white lady that people have said they've seen sitting in the cemetery of Bachelor Grove outside of Chicago. And some people have gotten photographs of her, what they believe to be photographs of her, but she never stands still. There's nothing else going on around her. They can't speak to her and so on. So there's a lot of these types of many more of these types of non-responsive haunting experiences out there in the literature and in anecdotes and testimony by people who have experiences than there are these kinds of experiences that seem to be crossing over into another time or peering through and seeing something that happened in a previous time. So obviously the verification methods are important to scientific parapsychology, and the SPR ones I'll talk about in a second. Then there's anecdotes with historical research, similar to what Andrew Mackenzie did, although he was very much interested in getting as much eyewitness testimony as he could and then trying to corroborate that. Anecdotes simply retold. And then what we're looking for is what makes something definitely a recurrent non-responsive haunting and what doesn't. What adds this extra element that we think it might be a time slip. So the SPR leaders, this is just a picture of them. You can see all these folks who don't look very excited about life at all were actually very intrepid researchers, and they did some really, really wonderful stuff. Henry Sidgwick was a philosopher. His wife, Eleanor Sidgwick, was the treasurer of Newnham College. They met each other because they were agitating as young people for education for women in the 1870s in England, and they met and got married in that era. Frederick Myers was a school inspector, but he was also a poet and a great psychologist in a time period when there weren't psychologists yet. And Edmund Gurney was one of their group as well, who did a lot of work cataloging and keeping track of what was happening in all of their research. And as you can imagine, that was a daunting task when there were no computers and not too many typewriters, and everything was pretty much handwritten and tied up in, there weren't even rubber bands. You had to use little red tape to tie around all of the little pieces of paper so that you could keep them separate in separate categories. So imagine that. But he did a lot of amazing work. And they cataloged many, many cases of a variety of different kinds, and they were very much interested in understanding ghost and haunting phenomena. So these are things that were published in their journal, then the Proceedings of the Society for Psychical Research. Now they have a journal, which was more of a newsletter then. So you can tell by looking at these titles that they were interested in a lot of different things. But Phantasms of the Dead was one of the things they were interested in, haunted houses, apparitions of the Virgin, just about everything that you can think of, including how to statistically analyze that very last one on the bottom, how to statistically analyze these kinds of cases. And on the right-hand side of the slide, I have their current, because they're still around. They were founded in 1882, and they're still going strong. Their main website and Science Encyclopedia, which is newly launched, and you can become a member and get their materials. And this is the McLuhan-Gauld case, Edgehill and another battlefield apparition in England, and I'll put that up in the library. Thanks, Medora. Thank you for coming. I am actually recording this, so it will be up on the internet at some point. And please come by the library in about a week or so, and I will have everything up in the library, and I'll give all of that to Tahiti too, so she can put it up in the pavilion. So the SPR methodology was separate interviews with witnesses, historical information at a deeper level, floor plans, attempts to communicate, whether that's communicating with the witnesses or communicating in some other way, and then independent corroboration of testimony, historical detail, and of events. And it's never perfect, but you can get pretty close in a lot of things. So we had talked about theory at the beginning, and as you'll remember, there's a variety of things, and what we're trying to do is figure out which of these fit the most of the cases. And we know in reality, as we get to understand these cases better, that there's a lot of different kinds of causal factors in the same case collection. So eventually we hope to be able to really separate all of this stuff out and figure out what is a hallucination and what might be subreal communication and what might be an intrusion of time and what might be just some kind of replay. We have no idea how it could possibly be encoded in the environment, but that's what it seems to be. So the theoretical area is an area that's very underdeveloped, and we hope to make more progress on that in the next 100 years. So I'm at the end now, and I just wanted to ask you to come, give you an invitation to come and visit the AZIRE Library and Learning Center in the Chilbo Community in Madhupak. All of these books that you see in this picture, this is the main floor. These are all new books, and there's click-offs to the Amazon listings for these books, so you can take a look and see if there's something you would like to purchase. On the second floor, we have a library of things that are freely available on the internet. So these little bookcases full of things are all articles that you can get on the internet, and I will be putting up all of the articles that I've used, that I have PDFs of, in this library for next week. So you can come over and go up to the third floor and pick them up and download them and read them for yourself. You could even hang out there for a long time if you'd like. And if you want to get in touch with me directly, I'm Maggie Larimore, and my email in real life is nancy@theazire.org. And in Second Life, you can see that I have given you the direct link. If you pick up the information that's in the box next to me on the floor, the Chilbo box, you'll be able to pick up the landmark. You'll have the walking tour of the area, and we'll be able to see some of the other really wonderful things that go on in the Chilbo community. We have quite a lot of great things. There's a Halloween dance floor. There's another library. There's all kinds of wonderful things to do in Chilbo, and we'd love to have you come and take a look. To hang around. I know I've kept you in your seats for quite a while, so just if you need to go, I understand completely. But if you have any questions that you want to ask me, I would be more than happy to attempt anyway to answer them. And thank you all for coming. I'm very pleased that you all came along. Thank you, Marla. Thanks, Fidgets. Thank you, Margaret. Thanks, Kaz. Thanks, Brian. And I would like to say thank you to Tahiti for giving me this opportunity. And I know for certain that the next three speakers are very, very, very bright people. They can talk about the physics side of the field. They're very interested in precognition and consciousness. Dean Radin, who is going to be coming, is the senior researcher at the Institute for Noetic Sciences. Dick Biermans at the University of Amsterdam, and Dr. Julia Mossbridge is a neuroscientist who just recently started with ions as well. So they should be fascinating, and if you go to the pavilion next door, you'll see videos about them and books and all that stuff, and I certainly have some of their articles in my library. Anything else, guys? Oh, good.
I was wondering if you are aware that they're doing any research on vague question, if I can phrase it right. I know that sometimes if you're in a historical place, you can actually put yourself in a mindset where you wonder so strongly what it was like back then. You can almost imagine yourself there. At the same time, if there's a haunting or some kind of apparition or some something lingering from the past in the building or in the atmosphere, and that tries to reach us because it's an extra emotional time period from the past. Is there any research being done on the barrier between the two and whether or not that exists in all cases that we know of? Or if there are cases where there's actually no barrier at all and the two different dimensions, so to speak, or situations mingle?
As far as I know, we have quite a lot of people who do field investigations. Kieran O'Keefe from Buckinghamshire New University is someone who does a lot of research on these topics, and Dr. Simon Sherwood from the University of Northampton. But in terms of specifics, they're still gathering cases and trying to look for all of the variables that might make our ability to touch these past experiences, because not everybody that walks into a historical place can pick up on the atmosphere. Not everybody who goes through there comes out with an experience of either being able to easily imagine what happened in that place or feel that they've become a part of it. So they, in addition to what's going on in the physical space and what is it about the physical space that makes it open to this kind of interpretation or this kind of experience, we also have to look at the psychological variables of the individuals themselves. What kind of abilities do they have? Are they intuitive? Are they sensitive? Are they imaginative? Are they creative? What is it about them that allows them, out of all of their friends, or two people out of three people in the group, to be able to pick up material? And then there's certainly people who are looking for sounds that can be recorded that are not heard at the time, people that are filming and looking for evidence in filming. There are people who are trying to take photographs of these types of places and see what comes out on the photograph, and then there's other variables there about the photographic process. So there are people that are doing this type of research. They're not always, their results are not always going into the physics of it. We have a couple of people like Professor Bernard Carr, who's actually an astrophysicist in his day job. He's a professor of astrophysics. He's been involved with the Society for Psychical Research for a very long time, and he's one of the few physicists who wants to take in all of the research that people are doing, including the research on these types of phenomena, and try and figure out how can you spin a theory of the physical world that will take all of this into account. So it's a very, very small field because of the taboo. It's a very difficult thing to get interested in the field early on and be able to have a conventional career trajectory. It's certainly something that's held against you in if you're going for a university job, that kind of thing. A lot of people, exactly until you happen, that always happens, is people are very much against these things until they have to deal with it themselves, or someone that they trust and believe in is reporting these experiences, and they know that they're much more sensitive, say, than they are, and they believe that. So there's a lot of that going on. Yeah, it's the professional realm where it's mainly taboo. The skeptical movement is very strong in a lot of different countries, and a lot of the ways that we talk about what we're doing, it really has to change just to get people to listen to us. It's very unusual for people, and yeah, exactly, the woo-woo factor. It's very unusual for people who come out early and say, this is what I'm doing for the rest of my life, can have a normal kind of professional life. I mean, my husband and I sort of identified ourselves with the field in our 30s and consequently have not had the same kind of career trajectory as other people have had who have waited quite a bit longer to come out and say that they're interested. but a lot of people, Dr. Stephen Braudy, for instance, who's so very well known in the field, didn't even mention his interest until after he was tenured, because otherwise you're, taking part company with you as fast as they need to. So that's another difficulty. One of the things that we love about the situation in the United Kingdom is that the Chrysler professorship, which only lasted from 1985 to 2004, when our professor, Robert Morris, passed away suddenly at a young age, he had 22 graduate students, and almost all of those people went out and got conventional professional professorships and were able, in most cases, to establish paranormal research laboratories, parapsychology research laboratories, and have had their own graduate students and who have had their own graduate students, and now we have like a third or fourth generation past Dr. Morris who are in universities and are able to do some kind of research along these lines. For instance, Kieran O'Keefe was very well known as a ghost hunter and was on television in the UK and all that stuff, and still managed to get a professor to become a professor at Buckinghamshire New University in the UK, and still does his field investigations as well. So the United Kingdom does tend to be a little bit more tolerant of eccentricity and are a little bit more able to understand someone's competence even if they're interested in doing research in these fields. In the United States, if you're interested in or doing research in the field, there must be something wrong with you. So it's the general point of view is pretty negative. But other countries have a better way of looking at it as well. There are universities in Brazil and in France and in Australia and in Germany, and there's a group at the University of Lund in Sweden and so on. So there are places where you can do scientific research into these things, and people are trying to do it, but there are very few of us. Our professional organization only has about 300 members, and of those, many are people who are professionals in other fields and are just very interested in the area and aren't actually doing research. So we're all very much interested in the question that you raised, Tahiti. Once understood, I think it's going to make a big change in how we think about ourselves as human beings and how we think about how we interact with the physical world and what the limits of the physical world are, in fact. So, yeah, and I think you're so right, Tahiti. So many people, although every once in a while you run into a skeptical person who will say, oh, yeah, I've had some of those telepathy experiences, but, it must be some kind of a brain thing, Something's wrong with me when that happens. There are those people who can explain even their own experiences away, but there are not too many of them. I think a lot of people have experiences and know people they trust who have experiences, and then they start to ask questions. And once you get into the literature of the field, you start reading, it's very hard to dismiss what's happening and what's going on. And that's a good thing, because that means that our subject matter is not going to disappear completely. So any other questions? Yeah.
Thank you for everyone for coming today, and I'd specifically like to thank Maggie, because she is the bridge between Second Life and this taboo subject and all of you, and mainly responsible for getting most of the events set up on EVRE.
And I'm so grateful for the opportunity. I just think this is wonderful, and I'm really looking forward to Dean and Dick and Julia. Pretty good.
Yeah, there's the video for you folks who are still here. There's a video over in my library under the sign called, I think it's under Consciousness. The World Conference. It's called the World Conference on Non-Local Consciousness. And in that video is a panel of experts discussing these topics. And on the panel is Dean Radin and Julia. So go check out that video. It's really kind of explains the big picture of the science and the sociology end of it.
Yeah, they're very, very bright people. They're doing really great research that has a lot of overlap with what you've done here with the installation. They're very much interested in precognition and in time and how that impacts us and so on. And I think their speeches are going to be great. Well, thank you everybody for coming, and you've hung in so long. I'm really grateful to all of you for maintaining attention all this time. I could talk about this forever.
I could listen all day too.
I think we're both in kind of the same place.
Thanks again for coming. Enjoy the sin, and go check out Maggie's library at AZIRE. There's all kinds of stuff over there, and take your wallet with you in case you want to hit Amazon, because there's some good books there.
Oh, thank you very much. Yeah, it's great, and thank you guys, and thank you so much. Okay, bye-bye, everybody.
Bye-bye. Take care.
You too.
Hi there, I'm Lisette Coley. I'm president of Parapsychology Foundation, so welcome to our YouTube channel. We have lots to look at, so please check out our videos. Don't forget to subscribe. Thank you.